People working on DAOs tend to think of DAOs themselves as a certain type of organization that could range anywhere from a group of 2 people sitting together to millions of people all over the world and can include cities. But I think the relevant part is in the DAO industry, what we're working on is building technology in particular to enable more democratic and more decentralized forms of decision-making to take place in the first place. And then what people choose to do with them and where to apply them is completely up to everyone.
Are you interested in decentralized autonomous organizations, also known as DAOs? What do you think about technologies which enhance governance transparency? How can we involve more people in governance? Stay tuned for answers from Adam Miller.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Adam Miller, founder of MIDAO. We will talk about his vision for the future of cities, decentralized governance, transparency and accountability, information environments, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Adam Miller is a forward-thinking leader in decentralized governance and emerging technologies. As founder of MIDAO, he enables Web3 and AI projects, including decentralized autonomous organizations, also known as DAOs, to incorporate in the Marshall Islands, the only jurisdiction that explicitly recognizes their unique structure while providing limited liability to members. Formerly, he offered expert consulting on tech stack selection, launch, and operations for DAOs of all scales. Previously, he researched emerging technologies at Capital Group and co-led the EDGE-TREx IT rotation program. An active investor, startup founder, and nonprofit board member, Adam is dedicated to driving positive global change. And with that, Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your appearance on the podcast. And let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'm excited to talk to you about cities. I come from a background, at least the last several years, of working in the governance area in crypto, in particular working on DAOs or Decentralized Autonomous Organizations. And so when I think about the future of cities, the first thing I think about is governance. Let's start there and see where you want to take it.
We have had with EDGE-TREx talking about Liberland and how their system is based on blockchain and how it helps transparency and accountability and service-based governance. When you talk about governance, what does governance mean to you? And then we jump from there.
I think governance is the way that people collectively make decisions about anything. Usually when we talk about governance in the scope of a government or a city, we're talking about how everything within the city is governed. But of course, in the world that we live in today, we're very used to, in our normal cities, unlike Liberland, that the city does not usually have governance rights over most things. Most things are handled by your state or national, federal government. And then in the case of a place like the United States or Europe, at least, you have both the federal level and then the state level. And then whatever is left over from all the governance that they do is available for the city to decide. But of course, cities don't have to stay that way forever. You have places that are city states or places like Liberland or even Singapore, where the city is also the entire government and therefore has governance rights over everything.
And when you think about governance, you mentioned that it's the collective action of making decisions. Is it a collective action? And I'm asking this because my experience with governance in cities, in states, in federal settings is not necessarily a collective decision-making process. So please, Is it a collective decision-making process?
Good point. I think that the modern theory is that the power to govern is at least implicitly through a social contract given by all of us collectively to our governments and our leaders who are to some degree, generally chosen democratically, which can mean at least a wide spectrum of things. And so some decisions might actually be made more collectively, some much more centrally, probably most, but at least they affect all of us collectively. And therefore, we might want to think about governing them more collectively in the future.
Thank you very much for this description. And then how can we make it more collective? I assume here comes in the DAO.
People working on DAOs tend to think of DAOs themselves as a certain type of organization that could range anywhere from a group of 2 people sitting together to millions of people all over the world and can include cities. But I think the relevant part is in the DAO industry, what we're working on is building technology in particular to enable more democratic and more decentralized forms of decision-making to take place in the first place. And then what people choose to do with them and where to apply them is completely up to everyone. If we think about how we might apply this technology and these systems to a city, what that would mean is take a traditional American city, and this is going to be like cities in a lot of the democratic world. In a typical American city, you might have an election once a year or once every 2 years, really largely initially because it's economically infeasible to hold elections more often. There was never even the possibility considered that you could have a vote on something every day because it's just physically impossible to do. The cost, the infrastructure, the counting, the auditing, the collecting of ballots, the mailing, the phone calls, the texting, all this stuff that goes into elections, it takes months and it costs millions of dollars is going to be an understatement even for many large cities. At a federal or state level, we're talking about billions of dollars. It's so expensive to hold an election. Even if you look at large public companies that might have hundreds of thousands of shareholders, it costs them millions of dollars and takes weeks, if not months, to hold an election. So there was never the possibility of doing them more often. That's really, I think, the biggest place. And of course, there's transparency benefits, there's potential compliance and security benefits also of these blockchain systems. But let's just say for a second, we trust the election process that exists today. I think the biggest change is it reduces the cost and complexity and time that it takes to hold a vote or an election to near zero compared to the current system, such that if you wanted to, you could have votes every day, every hour. You could have fluid systems where, for example, whoever currently holds the plurality, like the majority, the highest amount of the staking, to use a crypto word, is the elected representative of our city. But as soon as some people unstake at any point in time and other people stake, now you have a new elected representative because someone else is in the lead. So you could literally even have continuous voting now.
Such an interesting and fascinating concept because on the one hand, the voters much more responsibility and opportunity to influence decisions and be in a collective decision-making process. At the same time, I could also imagine people getting very overwhelmed and very tired of, I could vote every day, but I don't want to. Yeah. It's way too overwhelming. How can we balance out this taking responsibility, taking action, using this really empowering tool, and at the same time not overwhelming the citizens or just the decision makers or everybody else?
Yeah, so we could probably summarize what you're talking about as low voter turnout. Having a small number of the potential voters, whether it's a company making decisions or a city making a decision as a government, this problem of low voter turnout. And I want to address it from a couple different angles. One is that it may not be as big of a problem as many people seem to think that it is or say that it is. And the reason I say that is ultimately, maybe what matters the most is that everyone involved has a right to vote when they want to, when it's important to them, when it's going to affect them, when they don't trust a small group of people to make the decision in the first place. Whatever situation comes up where someone finally says, oh boy, this one really matters to me for whatever reason, or it's really important that I vote on this one. Now you go vote. But maybe 99% of the time, it just doesn't matter whether that person votes or not. On the other side is, let's assume for a second that we do envision and want to work towards a world where people are more participatory in governance systems of all kinds. And I would certainly agree that today, when you talk to most people about, hey, wouldn't it be fun if you could be on like 3 boards, nonprofit boards, in addition to everything else you do? They're like, oh no, I don't want any more work to do. I certainly don't want to have to do that. I want someone else to do it. And that's maybe one of the simpler examples of something someone could get involved in. So I do think that there is a potential for a certain driving force to push society in a direction where people are more interested in being involved in governance. And that's the way our world is trending towards like a rental economy where nobody owns anything anymore, right? Cars are a great example. Housing is a great example where people are happy to not even just like rent or lease, but to just use as a service at whatever moment you need a car or a tool or whatever, you just rent it for that moment. Now, that can be convenient and financially compelling, but I think it has led to a world where people feel less ownership over the world around them. Unintentionally, we've ended up owning almost nothing. And as a result, perhaps that's one of the reasons we feel a little bit less connected, like our lives have a little bit less meaning. Perhaps it's important that we actually go in a direction where people do feel ownership by actually having ownership over more things in our lives. And whether that's the local park or the local charity or a decision that affects an entire city, perhaps once our culture changes so that people are more motivated to participate in governance of various kinds, perhaps that actually will be rewarding for people and they will participate.
I really hope that we reach this participation because it's also partially the mistake or the failure of the designers. And I'm an architect, so I will bash on architects because we have been providing the designs for the citizens, for urban users, and saying that this is what you get, be happy with it. And very few feedback loops were built in, has been built into this process itself. So people haven't necessarily learned that they can influence. So there is this kind of apathy and learned helplessness and the idea that they can't influence the outcome. So they won't even try. So I think that there is also the unlearning of this habit. Could you give us some examples of not the city DAO, but what the smallest things DAOs could be used for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say in my vision of the future, there will be family and friend group DAOs, in addition to high school chess clubs and other clubs in schools will be DAOs. And the reason I say that, it's not because a high school chess club necessarily needs all of the transparency and compliance guarantees of doing a governance and treasury management system on the blockchain as much as a city does. But I think ultimately when it's easier to open a DAO than it is to open a bank account and as comfortable for people, and it is safer than letting your neighbor or classmate Johnny hold all the cash under his mattress or the teacher keep all the money in his classroom, because who knows what the teacher might do. Yeah, maybe we're only talking about like the $500 that we're going to spend on the field trip in a few weeks. But ultimately that could matter. And I think in the case of family and friends, it'll be shared gift buying, shared vacations, shared nights out, maybe even shared governance rights or shared ownership over some future crypto-based asset that will be harder to purchase as an individual, or maybe even just more fun to buy with your friends once we get over all the challenges of nobody really wants a crypto wallet in the first place.
Yeah, I can understand that. My partner was struggling a bit with getting crypto because of banks not allowing to transfer between the bank and platform he could buy the crypto. So we will need to get over that kind of hurdle.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask about the technology itself. Because you are talking about technology, and in my understanding, technology is a very wide thing. So technology for me is the applied knowledge we apply to solve problems. We will get back to technology. But first, I would love to know whether you think that those could be viable without blockchain and crypto and this very modern technology.
That is a great point. I have been surprised since early on in Web3 and crypto that we have not seen someone like Amazon or Google or Apple get into the world of saying, hey, here's your shared database platform that is as good as a blockchain, but it's free and you can use your Amazon account for it instead of a wallet. And if you lose all your money, we'll give it back to you. And whatever the challenges are that have with Web3 wallets today. And I actually think there is opportunity for, and there probably are some web apps that are trying to go after, how do we go somewhere in between the Facebook group and an actual DAO? Like, how do we do the Facebook group that does have a little shared bank account, that does have access to some level of voting? Yes, there's polling. For example, look at Reddit groups. They still have moderators, which are basically like dictators for the Reddit group. What if Reddit said, instead of choosing a dictator, you can have a council of 5 people elected by the entire Reddit community that has to vote on any changes to the way that our Reddit forum is moderated? All this stuff, like, it often sounds initially like, why do we really need that? Until you're the person who is like really loves participating in the Reddit forum, loves or makes money off of, or it's relevant to their livelihood in some way. And they get kicked because the moderator had an opinion and there's no recourse and there's no democratic process whatsoever. I think things like that would be extremely valuable. I think all of the messaging and group related apps that we use, not only could that be valuable, but to our earlier conversation, I think people need to be potentially at a cultural level retaught what it's like to have democratic processes involved in many areas of our life, including group chats and web forums. And if platforms where most of those users congregate don't choose to introduce that and teach people about it, maybe eventually even decentralize it, that people might not demand it themselves because we've gotten used to this world that we live in that's full of little dictators. And if you don't like it, then you're just screwed.
Coming back to the technology question, what does technology mean to you? And second, what kind of technologies are needed for DAOs?
You mentioned earlier that technology is knowledge. I would say that technology is knowledge applied to build systems which help people do anything, whatever it is that it's involved in. And maybe I could come up with a better word than just anything, but really they're systems for people to interact with each other and or with the world. These systems get better over time as we gain more knowledge and then use that additional knowledge to build more systems. So the systems that need to be built and the knowledge that needs to be gained in the world of DAOs ranges from what we've already joked about, how Web3 and crypto already has a general usability problem that also applies to anything you want to do within crypto, whether it's DAOs, NFTs, meme coins, buying real estate on chain, whatever it is, and whatever level of seriousness. We've got to figure out either how to make Web3 wallets and the way we interact with blockchains a much better user experience, or maybe we need to wait until there's more of a disaster that happens in the world that causes people to finally be willing to learn how to use these difficult things, because suddenly we don't trust banks, insurance companies, maybe governments anymore the way we do today. I'm hoping for the former to happen before the latter, because it'd be nice to have a smoother transition to crypto than might happen if we wait for the zombie apocalypse. So that's one category of things that we need. And then if we look more specifically at DAOs, so this technology around groups collaborating over governance and treasury management, and some people would even throw in collaboration technology into the mix. Whereas the Slack that's more decentralized, or the Microsoft Teams or the Discord that's more decentralized and perhaps has more features built in that make it easier for people to perform governance collaboratively and manage a treasury to collaboratively. Whether you include that or not, these tools are still so new and so early stage. It seems we just need more time. I wish there was more capital being invested into this space, because then maybe we would be seeing more and faster and more diverse innovation. But the reality is there's probably only a handful of well-funded companies working on DAO technology, and then maybe a handful of groups of Web3 enthusiast web developers who have the DAO technology they've been building for many years and are still trying to tinker and trying to achieve better adoption. And when I talk about this technology, what it is a combination of smart contracts on the blockchain that do things like launch a token for you so that you can track who the members or owners or governance rights holders are in your organization. smart contracts that determine how to acquire or disperse of those governance rights, whether there's a financial component, whether it's one person, one vote, or one token, one vote, such that each person can have multiple votes, and how those tokens are acquired. And then also the system for casting proposals and allowing people to vote on those proposals and then automatically executing the outcome of the proposal if it's an on-chain activity like sending money that is the nature of the proposal. Still, I don't think we've even imagined a major way to have a proposal automatically force, for example, like a person to go do something when the proposal said this person should go do something, but that automates what it can. So there's all the smart contracts to do these things. And then there's the interface layer, which is just like a user interface, just like any web application or phone application or any piece of technology we use. There has to be a good user experience that helps people onboard, buy the token, enter into the DAO, collaborate with others, see the proposals that are submitted, cast the votes onto the blockchain, et cetera. And maybe provide analytics, like how much money do we have in our treasury and how is that money allocated across different assets that we might own. So you've got the front end and the back end, you could say, except the front end is really just an entire app. And the back end in this case is the smart contracts that actually run on the blockchain. And I think we're making a lot of progress on that front. There's tools today like Decent is a cool one that people can check out, Decent DAO. I think it's at decent.labs. And it's one of my favorite DAO tooling platforms. It's one of the best token launching platforms. There's a few really good tools out there that are the best user experience and the easiest to use. And yet still, I couldn't honestly tell one of my business friends that I'm connected to on LinkedIn who's not working in crypto that this isn't that hard. Now, the reality is like the current way of doing these things, if you want to do them in a structured, enforceable, at least legally enforceable way, is also pretty hard. Hiring a lawyer or using AI or LegalZoom or something to generate contracts and then filing things with governments is also time consuming and challenging. But we all have a lot of experience doing it. If you're a business person who's founded a company or a nonprofit, a charity, a government-related organization, like we know how to do that stuff. And then when you have to learn a whole new set of tools that also takes knowledge, practice, collaboration with other parties, and then on top of it, a Web3 wallet and the ability to interact with the blockchain and Web3, it's just still pretty challenging.
Which we hope that it will become easier with time. Or we learn from it and create better systems. When we talk about blockchain, and we'd also describe this in episode 370, when we talk about blockchain and governance on blockchain, it really helps with the transparency and accountability. And I personally don't have a really good relationship with governance because I can't see in current systems that they are really transparent. I can know what's happening in the system or that they are really accountable. So one set thing gets done in governance. Do you agree with it that, for example, blockchain and DAOs really help with accountability and transparency? How would this shift happen if we would shift to DAOs?
Definitely transparency. And maybe what I mean by transparency is transparency without the need to trust any human being. Some of our governance systems, some governments of the world may still provide a good level of transparency. And people may trust the people who are reporting on who voted for what and what was done with the money and who actually did what and said what. But I think increasingly, even in an age where with AI, for example, it's really easy to fake things. How do you even know the person you're listening to on X or YouTube is really them? Now, maybe that's something that's just starting to be an issue. But if you had your governance and your financial management take place on the blockchain, anyone could theoretically, and I say that just because there's like math and computer science involved, but at least a large number of parties could independently verify that the votes that we were told were cast were actually cast the way we were told, and that the money that this agency said it sent to that agency and that agency said it spent on XYZ last year, at least you'd have an equivalent of a paper trail that is immutable and in some senses impossible to fake or change. And so you do get that level of transparency. Now, I think the accountability part, I would not necessarily say is automatically better because of the blockchain. When it comes to accountability of people actually doing what they say they're going to do, that information is not on the blockchain. You may have a record of what they said they're going to do if it went through a proposal, or even if we have a social media platform that's running on a blockchain, you could show that this senator's wallet actually did sign a post where the senator said this actual thing. Now, of course, the wallet could have been stolen. Someone else could have the seed phrase. There's still risks there, but at least you have a better sense that someone actually said the thing or promised to do the thing. But then how do you verify that the person actually did it? That's still happening in meat space in the real world. You still need some kind of physical, real world journalism or watchdog or verification. Now, there are really interesting technologies coming down the line to help with that, at least take us further to a world where we can independently verify things like a phone or a camera that has a trusted piece of hardware built in that has GPS and date and time stamped cryptographically into a photo. So that, for example, as long as we trust Sony is actually making the cameras and the chips correctly, and that we're not dealing with a North Korean hacker group that maybe figured out how to break into these chips, that a photo where someone said this was a photo taken yesterday in this war zone at this address, now we actually know that it was taken there. And similarly, like the camera actually belonged to the staffer of the senator, and maybe the senator signed the post with the senator's crypto wallet. Like now we are getting a pretty good, again, like a digital paper trail of the information and a better ability to verify. It's almost like a supply chain of information, but still a lot of accountability is not going to be enforced with the technology. It's going to come down to people. And did the person really do the thing they said they did? And even then, like we all argue about, even when the person did do what they said they did they do it exactly how they said they did? You're going to have 50-50 difference in perspective on that, regardless of what was written on the blockchain.
Which I would say is a concept regarding these kind of processes and systems. What are the three biggest fears or concerns regarding the future of cities for you?
My biggest fear is not directly tied to governance. I would say my biggest fear is more about the information environment that we've created and that we live in. And the fact that people's information networks are increasingly based on their digital lives, which have minimal to no connection to where they physically live. And as a result, the people that we connect with and end up having things in common with, sharing political beliefs with, I think is a good example. Anywhere where we have a lot of political strife and disagreement right now, part of the reason for that could be that my political views are being shaped by what I see and hear on my phone and at my desk, and not by my interactions that I have that live in the same city that I live in, or even on the same block. And as a result, when I run into the person I live next to and we start talking about politics, we find out that we're living in completely different realities as far as what we think is like a foundational level of truth or the way you're supposed to approach things. And so that can make it harder, I think, to feel like we belong, to connect with people. Of course, it's not all about politics. Maybe we can all agree to disagree about some things, but still, even our interests and our values may end up diverging to the extent that a city that maybe in 2025, people have some like more correlated values, interests, beliefs, thought systems, mindsets, et cetera. If that correlation dies down further and further because of our information systems being almost entirely digital and global, then I think the value and benefit of cities, you could argue that diversity is good in that regard as well. But I think when it comes to like our enjoyment of our lives and how we find meaning, we might be happier human beings if we're surrounded by people that are more similar to us instead of more different.
I will give you the other end of the spectrum. Because I am from Hungary, and the Hungarian government is really good at influencing the media and influencing the information which is shared locally. So when we talk with our families back in home, we see the information disparity. So one news piece, one fact could be reported in a very different light, which is locally the same, But since we see other stuff online due to the information environment we create, we see that what they hear is not the fact, not the reality. I understand what you mean, that we could lose the connection to each other, connection to the place, if we just live in the digital information world. But at the same time, I also think that it's somehow needed to burst the bubbles we create with the local environments. Do you have any idea how we could balance this kind of information environment?
Absolutely. I think if we have a very diverse kind of information amongst people who live amongst each other and would benefit from having more things in common, we need to develop systems, and systems may not even be the right word because it's like cultures and ways of thinking that lead us to be able to live in a more friendly and productive manner with the people who disagree with us so much. And maybe this is more about politics and other things. Again, I'm not sure. But even when it comes to politics, we'd have to have more of a culture of productive disagreement and a society that therefore as a dependency values that and communicates that throughout its culture. So I think that could be a good factor. What I'd be really curious to know, I wonder if you have an opinion on this, is in those places where the government does control the message and therefore people are getting a much more consistent information environment, are they happier? Are they better off in certain ways? Even if that information environment, even if we don't like the idea that the government is the one making that decision and we maybe don't like the people who are doing it right now, but is it possible that we could do an economic study on this, right? If there's places that for exogenous reasons are having a more consistent information environment, and we could perhaps extract out all of the other reasons for correlation, we can maybe see if people are actually happier in those places where there's more government control over media just because of the more consistent information environment.
This is my personal opinion. I think that maybe on the short term, they would be happier because they don't have too much fighting opinions. Again, we could agree to disagree very politely and constructively. I completely believe that. But on the long term, I think that kind of information bias or information bubble creates a much bigger divide between reality and the information environment and the opinions. And that on the long run either creates a bigger crash or a bigger fight. Because then there is already the sunk cost bias that if I believed something for just 1 year, because we are talking about short terms, and then someone says that this is not the reality after 1 year, there is the sunk cost bias, and then people just double down maybe on the not factual information. In my personal opinion, because I love to think in long term, I love to think in 20, 50 years, although I think that in a 1 year period, that could help a lot. I don't think that's a good idea because then we are losing the vision, we are losing the long-term benefits of let's have conversations. Let's politely fight out these differing opinions because then we can progress, we can improve. And also this comes from my own personal experience that I can see this disparity, for example, in my home country. And we are not necessarily really happy with the situation that this information disparity creates.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm not a fan of government control over information ecosystems. I think I'm expressing a problem with the free market of information system without giving you a solution. Unfortunately, I know a lot of people, at least I hear a lot of people talking publicly about something similar, which is if you just look at the supply and demand of information, it is extremely expensive to produce accurate and useful information. Whether we're talking about textbooks or really good journalism, extremely expensive. It is extremely inexpensive, cheap, fast, practically free to produce unlimited amounts of terrible information that may be at least harmful by being misinformation and perhaps going into the realm of disinformation that's actively and intentionally harmful. And then on the demand side, it's much more boring to read real textbooks and read really good journalism for most people, at least, I think for all of us, than it is to just watch maybe in the future, like AI generated TikTok and YouTube slop that's like purely entertaining, maximizes our dopamine hits, but has nothing to do with reality. And so in the completely free market of information, we have both really a supply curve and a demand curve that are both going to push really hard towards the world being full of terrible information that people prefer. So I think it's important that we try to think about systems that remain free from centralized government control, or at least that we imagine new types of governments and new types of governance to bring it back to governance so that we can have some kind of collective system that helps us create a better information environment without having to hand over power to a too powerful centralized government.
That's why, for example, I don't know too much about X, but what they did with the spectrum on you can choose how much information you want to get outside of your bubble. So there is a spectrum you can choose this kind of additional information outside the information you want to see. And the second is what they did, as far as I understand, is the community notes that if someone thinks that an information is false, they can flag it as false and they can provide the right information. For example, that kind of thinking could be something good or driving us towards a better governance of information, as you talked about.
I'll give you another idea, which brings it back to the idea of cities, or at least the people we live amongst, which is if we could apply our real life social networks to our technological consumption of information. So whether it's news, whether it's product reviews, whether it's shopping, whatever it is, if my web browser, for example, or a plugin in it was aware of my actual social connections, the people that maybe I am connected to on Facebook, at least theoretically, my neighbors, if it knew the people I like to hang out with in my neighborhood and it knew what they were reading and what they like and what shops they like to go to, now my computer, my technology could actually tell me, hey, let's slide you in the direction of the people you live around and at least see what the other people in your neighborhood are interested in or buying or whatever it is.
Which brings us really neatly into a question I wanted to ask about privacy. Mm-hmm. Because you mentioned this kind of information coming from the physical world to the digital world, connecting it to your preferences in the information environment as well. But also you were talking about how our devices could be used to factually prove that what we state, what somebody else states, what the photo shows is real. It's a really good opportunity to create factual information. At the same time, it also creates fear of privacy because if it's automated, for example, then I can't control what kind of information would it provide. So how could this kind of new governance, DAOs, blockchain help with privacy? If these decentralized solutions help with transparency, how can we balance out transparency and privacy?
It's a really tough one. And the first thing that comes to mind is an indirect answer. In the world of DAOs, aside from the technology that we're building, there do tend to be common values and interests in the community. And I would say one of those that's fairly common is for DAOs to be places that you can freely enter and leave anytime and to build systems. So there's something called rage quitting, which is a funny name that's popular in a certain subset of the world of DAOs, where the idea is that at any point in time, you can rage quit, basically leave the DAO that you're in and take with you your relative portion of the DAO's assets, whatever those assets are. Presumably, if there were liabilities, you should take those too, but basically leave any time with your share. Whether it's rage quit or whether it's simply a more equitable way of entering and leaving, if we're talking about countries and cities, we have very little choice about the countries that we live in and that we're citizens in. At least most people do. An idea for the future is certainly to let people choose more on that dimension as well. If you give people that kind of choice, now you can have DAOs where there's complete transparency and DAOs where there's complete privacy. And you can have cities where there are security cameras everywhere. And you can have cities where there are security cameras nowhere and let people choose between them. I think something like that might be the ideal solution. And then certainly to build our technology so that they allow for either. I think one of the unfortunate things because of governments of the world is that privacy technology on blockchain has been really held back. Very few, like a couple major blockchains are actually built around privacy instead of transparency. People for a long time thought that Bitcoin was private because you weren't giving it your name. But it turns out that it's not that hard for the FBI or whoever it is to figure out who's who in the world of Bitcoin. I think to program in options and let people choose what society they want to live in, whether it's a company, whether it's a city, whether it's a country, just like the information ecosystem topic we were discussing before, there may not be a perfect answer. Perhaps the answer is to let people choose, and not just choose. When you let people choose, that also creates a competition. Assuming there's some value to the system of each additional person who chooses it, which I think there usually is, then those systems would have to compete by trying to create whatever privacy environment they think is going to be most optimal to the largest number of people or to their target market or however they might want to think about it.
Which is a really good opportunity. So what are the three biggest opportunities regarding the future of cities for you?
Definitely more democratic governance, more inclusive governance, by which I really just mean including more people in governance over more things. It's the same thing that could apply to companies and states. It's really that core DAO idea that you could have things be more democratic, leave more things up to community voting or staking, et cetera. At least trying and seeing if people are interested in that. We talked about the fact that who's going to want to vote on the color of the building at the park near me? Maybe it's just the 10 of us who live around the park, and maybe that's fine. Lots of complexities to that. And actually, that leads me to the second biggest opportunity, which is I think cities tend to be one of the smallest organizations in our lives today that are still highly democratic. But why not go smaller? Now, of course, there are companies and charities which can be, and actually, I'll say this, nonprofits, what a lot of people call charities, that may be one of the biggest opportunities for more democratic governance. And I think nonprofits already play a huge role, especially maybe in cities, but at any level of scale that we might want to think about. Today, most nonprofits everywhere in the world are controlled by small boards, 3 people, 5 people, 20, maybe 30. It was just, I think, assumed by the people, the way the current system developed, that because there was no profit motive or no ability to distribute profit to shareholders, that no one would want to be a shareholder, that you wouldn't have potentially 100,000 people who want to own part of a nonprofit. But I think what we've seen in crypto already and what has been made possible is the idea of having nonprofit organizations like NGOs also, that are actually governed by the entire community of people that they represent or support, or the people that are impacted by them, or just the people who are interested in it. These nonprofits that are all over the place and collaborate a lot with governments, including local governments, they're all controlled by really small numbers of people. And so whether it's the nonprofits that already exist, even the idea that we may be able to have smaller, kind of like I said earlier, you could have a family DAO or a high school club DAO. We could also have a neighborhood DAO. What could this new technology enable in terms of governance models for HOAs, which are another big part of cities? A lot of cities are homeowners associations, these little cartels that people sometimes love and sometimes hate. I think often hate, but choose to be a part of nonetheless. Maybe often not knowing what they're getting into when they move into a new neighborhood with an HOA. But HOAs also, it's an elected board. And by the way, the thing with most nonprofits is the board's not even elected. It's whoever started the thing chose the first board, and that board chooses all the boards that come after it. And at least homeowners associations, I don't know if it's by law, but I think generally speaking, elect their board. And then that board has control over what color they can paint their house and how long their lawn can be, probably a lot of more important things too. So at all these different levels within a city, the opportunity is give more control over more things back to smaller groups of people, not just even keep it within the city and then let everyone vote on it, but give the control of the park back to the 100 or 1,000 people who live closest to that park. I think it's an idea that most people react and say, that's just who would want to do that? Or how could you ever do that? Or the city has all the money. But there really are models that could make this possible. And actually, it's being tried in Japan and probably other places too. But I followed the progress of DAOs and legal entities for DAOs, because it's a part of DAOs that I work in is legal structures. For whatever reason, it's been popular in Japan to try out DAOs in small communities to govern shared resources, the commons, right? It's the classic commons. That's a common topic in economics. I think that's a big opportunity for cities as well. They could either just reallocate that funding that goes towards that park to that group of people, or we could create a new type of system where you can have taxes on smaller scales in cities. So it's not just the city collecting taxes, but maybe a non-HOA community of people via the charter and the rules of the city could be allowed, if enough people vote for it, to choose a tax of some amount on the people who live within a certain radius. And that tax would go into a shared treasury that's governed by those same people for the purpose of, for example, supporting a park or whatever else it is. So that's two opportunities for cities. For the third one, I would probably just go back to this question of information ecosystems that we talked about earlier and say, clearly people think at least that we have meaningful problems today in how humans are interacting with each other when it comes to especially politics, and that politics are affecting many parts of our lives. Now, I think there's a meaningful chance that we actually just think that, and it's not even true. I'm not saying it's necessarily more than 50%. But the nature of how our media is changing, again, it's definitely changed how we think. Maybe it's changed how we think in a way that we think things are much worse than they really are. We've seen how that's definitely true about the news. Almost everyone thinks that things are much worse than they really are because our human brains are used to seeing, when we see an example of something every night, we think it's happening everywhere. And we have just absolutely no conception of how common it really is and what's the trend line and whatever else. And especially at the scale of our nations and the scale of our cities, there's going to be unfortunately, there's going to be terrible things happening every night in that city. And when the city's twice as big, it's going to happen twice as often, even if nothing's changed. But I digress a little bit. I would challenge cities to the opportunity of taking on that problem of not information ecosystems, but how people deal with them. And how can we encourage culture to develop or redevelop in a way that people become more philosophical, more interested in figuring out the best way to live and the best way to think, the best way to interact with other people? How do we encourage people to care more about learning and education? Even families and family values. Hopefully that's not too controversial of a term these days, because I don't think it should happen at the federal level or the state level. In most places, these cultural things are things that people should have choice in. So could cities maybe get involved in trying to influence the way we live and think to combat these challenges that we're having on a global scale?
So small opportunities, which is really nice. Yeah. I would love to know whether you are optimistic or hopeful about the future, because you have been talking about pretty huge challenges. At the same time, you were also talking about pretty huge opportunities. Are you optimistic and hopeful about the future?
Yeah, I have the sense that's more of a personality trait than a rational conclusion. When I try to be really rational, I think there's possibilities that we cannot possibly put probabilities on. And therefore, it's really hard to know what's the chance of nuclear disaster or nuclear war? What's the chance of a complete collapse of the Western economic system? And obviously, some people might care more about the whatever other economic systems, but that's the leading one in today's world. And what's the chance that happens in the next 5 years? Or what's the chance of a complete collapse of the dollar? These are really hard to predict. And any of those things also could both, especially in the case of war, a nuclear war, be mostly terrible. In the case of an economic collapse, it could just be easier to consider the natural development of humankind is that our current systems need to collapse before the new ones can be built. Especially being in America, where the dollar is based and this global economic system is controlled from in ways that are clearly unfair. I often talk to people about how we know that the work that we're doing could help lead to some very uncomfortable years for ourselves as human beings. And yet it seems clearly like the right thing to do. So it's really hard to just boil it down to optimistic or pessimistic. I think actually it might be more productive to be optimistic. So maybe something people should try to do, irrespective of their core rational beliefs. So I put myself in the optimism camp, but you can hear I have also some reservations about that as well.
That could be called realist optimism. And I also agree with your notion that it's much more productive to be optimistic. There was recently a scientific research that optimists live longer, but that might be just because optimists look for the positives. Optimists look for solutions. So they just don't give up on seeing problems. And I also in this camp because I'm talking to you guys, my interviewees who are working on the better solutions, which brings us neatly to your role. Adam, what is your role in establishing the future of cities?
What I do is I work with the government of the Marshall Islands, which is a sovereign country in the South Pacific, former US territory, former Japanese territory, former German colony, actually, and currently a sovereign nation. And I've worked with their government to help them write laws and regulations that are some of the best in the world for crypto-related projects, also for AI agents, to virtually domicile their business there, so that they can do things like launch a token with good, compelling, reasonable token laws, and to have a DAO that's fully governed on chain and doesn't have all these traditional requirements that are required of normal types of organizations. And then our company, it's called MIDAO, MIDAO, stands for Marshall Islands DAO. We really don't only serve DAOs anymore. Again, it's really anyone in crypto or AI agents, but we help people create these, what's called DAO LLCs. So there's a nonprofit and a for-profit option of the DAO LLC. The nonprofit is a lot like the Cayman Foundation, but just way better and less expensive for anyone who's doing things in crypto. So through this work, what you make me think about is I would like at some point to apply what I'm learning to other places, to the network state movement, for example, right? This whole movement of people like Liverland, places like Prospera, special economic zones and cities and small countries around the world that are all working to try to innovate in the nature of governance, the nature of sovereignty, the nature of places, or even to turn my sights on my home country, America, and say, how can I help us develop our laws and regulations here in a way that's going to be conducive to a better future for all? Even just simple things like better securities laws so that DAOs can flourish in ways that are hindered in meaningful ways by the SEC as well as European securities regulators in ways that I don't think are helpful. Today, I'm really helping a small country and helping the projects that want to virtually domicile there. Perhaps I will be able to apply all of that to other cities and places as well.
Why are you working in this field?
I'm so passionate about and interested in crypto, both from a technological, economic, and more personal human perspective. This technology could lead to more utopian or more dystopian futures than we had ever imagined before the technology came around. Like AI, by the way, would be another fun area, and I do spend a lot of time with AI now, would be another fun area to work. But to me, these two areas, including crypto and especially DAOs, because DAOs are specifically focused on using crypto to coordinate people for the purpose or the help of usually some kind of governance. I see the connection between that and just how we all want to make lives better for ourselves, our neighbors, our friends, our family, the other citizens of the places that we live. So that's what drew me to it. And then I, by happenstance, ended up doing exactly what I'm doing. I was starting a DAO consulting company called DAO Platform, and I had a number of clients in a short amount of time. There was a lot of people, and I think there still are a lot of people who are saying, should I start a DAO? What could I do with a DAO? Stuff like that. But I came across this problem that there was nowhere good in the world to register a DAO as a legal entity. Like people might just think about corporations or LLCs as the most common ones. And there was nowhere good to do it. And around that time, Wyoming had passed the first DAO LLC law in the world. And we built on what they had done and passed the second in the world, the first by a sovereign nation, which was the DAO Act and this DAO LLC law. And when it passed, we were surprised. So were the senators that we worked with in the Marshall Islands. You just never know how something like this will go over. And so 4.5 years ago, when the law passed, I decided I should leave the consulting gig where I was learning about DAOs and helping DAOs and get into the legal structure side of it. So some degree of happenstance as well. And now I feel like, I've never been personally in a position where I'm running a sustainable startup, financially sustainable. We're not going to the moon anytime soon or recently. We're also not going out of business because we have customers, we have revenue. It's enough to support ourselves. And that's given me a freedom to realize that gives me time to think, to interact with people, to try to figure out the most innovative thing we could do as a business or that I can do as an individual. And I don't know yet where that will take me, but that's how I got here.
Please keep up this good work because we need this kind of thinking on how these new technologies could help us create better futures, such as with better governance. So I personally am very excited where you guys are going with your solutions. Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
Maybe the future of cities isn't even cities. What's the future of sovereignty? Sovereignty refers generally to what we now think of as countries. Who are the organizations or people in the world who ultimately have ultimate power to do whatever they want with no rules? And it's only been since the late 1800s. People like to talk about the Westphalia Conference or treaty or something like that. I think in the late 1800s, that was basically the countries of the world coming together and saying, from now on, everything is going to be countries and there's going to be nothing else. And so for 150 or so years, we've lived in a world where that is like the core foundational assumption and feeling that everyone has, is that the world is made up of countries. And then countries are made up of sometimes other states and sometimes cities. But for a long time in history, cities were sovereign much more than there were countries. And then sometimes they ended up part of countries. Not only might the future be devoid or different from the current monopoly that the concept of countries has on the earth, but perhaps something even different from cities and states. I'll recommend one book if anyone hasn't read it. It's called The Sovereign Individual. It was written in the late 90s and predicted a lot and also theorized a lot about what the future might look like and what it might take to change it in meaningful ways like what we're talking about. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you.
It was really interesting to hear from Adam about the smallest scales DAOs could work, not to mention his description on DAOs and their effect on governance transparency. Vidya Lichka described how Liberland utilizes their public blockchain technology for government transparency in episode 370. You can find out more about Adam online, or the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Adam's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?